Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, we're going to talk about the difference between clean and unclean animals and clean and unclean people, and we're going to talk about Deuteronomy 12:15 and what it means. Whenever I first started getting into observing the biblical commands, one of the things that was a major shift for me initially, of course, was the dietary laws, talking about not eating unclean animals. And as I was beginning to try to observe this, and as I was proposing that this is what we do, some people brought to my awareness that apparently a Christian argument against this is Deuteronomy 12:15. Deuteronomy 12:15 talks about whenever we're in the land and whenever we want to eat meat, that the clean and unclean shall eat it alike. And this was a confusing verse to me. It was a verse that didn't really make sense to me. I didn't understand what it was saying. And I just kind of assumed that, okay, we're talking about eating, we're talking about food and meat, and we're talking about clean and unclean. So maybe it means that, like, if I had a dog being an unclean animal, the dog could eat the clean meat that I'm slaughtering. And I was confused. I didn't really know what was going on. And I knew that, well, it says Leviticus 11, we're not supposed to eat these animals. It says in Deuteronomy 14, we're not supposed to eat these animals. So we must not be allowed to eat these animals. So what's going on here? Well, there's a difference between clean and unclean people and clean and unclean animals. And we need to draw that distinction. So when we're talking about clean and unclean animals, the reason that they're clean or they're unclean is because of the characteristics of the species. So when we're looking at Leviticus 11 or Deuteronomy 14, generally we're talking about specific criteria, specific physical attributes of the animal. So with aquatic life, the clean ones are supposed to have both fins and scales. And so if we're talking about like a crab, for example, a crab doesn't have fins and scales, and so automatically all crabs, therefore, are not clean. All of those species, all of that type of animal is unclean. And whereas when we're talking about cattle, for example, and a cow has cloven hooves and he ascends the cud. Those are the two criteria for beasts. All cattle are clean. All cattle, at least when they're alive and at least talking about the animal itself, is clean. Now, of course, if we're getting into eating it and someone has fried the cow meat in pig lard or something, then we're talking about a slightly different situation. But when we're talking about animals, all cattle are going to be clean. And so when we're talking about the difference between clean and unclean animals, we're talking about their physical characteristics of the species as a whole, not individual animals here and there. However, when we're talking about clean and unclean people, it's a different issue. It's a different distinction. We're not talking about all people. Certain people are always unclean or certain people are always clean, for example. There are different things and different situations that can cause people to become unclean or to become clean. And so, for example, leprosy, as some people translate it, as it's popularly referred to, a leper, generally speaking, is unclean. A leprous person was originally clean and they have become unclean because of the leprosy. And there's a specific ritual that they must go through, and they must be either cured from the disease or there are a couple other situations, but in order for them to become clean again. And likewise, whenever a woman gives birth to a child, or whenever a woman is on her period, those situations can cause the woman to become unclean as well, and there are certain ways that is remedied. And of course, hauling an unclean animal, a dead unclean animal, or touching an animal that just died, that wasn't slaughtered, touching a clean animal that just died, those cause us to become unclean. And so we must wash our clothes and wash our bodies in order to become clean again. So we're talking about a very different concept than we would be with regard to animals. An animal, depending on its species, is always either clean animal or unclean animal. A person, on the other hand, can become unclean through actions or situations, or they can become clean through actions and situations. So let's talk about Deuteronomy 12 now. In Deuteronomy 12, it's talking about whenever we enter into the land and we're living on our own personal property, there might be a situation where we decide, hey, I want to eat some meat. And so we might want to slaughter an animal that we had, for example. Well, in this passage, it talks about the clean and the unclean shall eat alike, that it shall be slaughtered as the deer, as the gazelle. So what's going on here? Well, we're talking about clean and unclean people. We're not talking about clean and unclean animals, because we were already told in Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 what animals we're supposed to eat, what animals we're not supposed to eat. So it's not an issue of that. What's going on is we're talking about differentiating between clean and unclean people. And when it comes to the ritual slaughters, the sacrifices that are supposed to be done at the tent of meeting or at the tabernacle, we need to be clean whenever we are performing them, whenever we're going to the tabernacle. However, if we're just slaughtering in our own gates, as Deuteronomy 12 is talking about, Deuteronomy 12:15 is telling us that it doesn't matter whether we're clean or unclean. That, say someone is defiled for some reason, say a woman just gave birth to a child, she can still eat of this animal that's being slaughtered for eating. It's not being slaughtered in the way that we would sacrifice at the tabernacle. It's talking about just slaughtering for our own personal enjoyment or our own personal nutrition. And so therefore, when we're talking about this passage, we need to distinguish what's going on. What are we talking about, clean and unclean? We're talking about clean and unclean people. And animals are always either clean or unclean based upon their characteristics, based upon their species. However, people can become clean or unclean based upon actions. But that we can still eat meat within our gates, according to Deuteronomy 12:15, whether we are clean or unclean. Thanks for watching. Feel free to like this video and share it if you think it could be useful to others. And feel free to subscribe if you have not already, so we can stay in touch and so we can talk about more biblical command issues. Thanks for watching. Remember the commands. Peace.